I can still feel the texture of that damask tablecloth beneath my fingertips, the way the afternoon light fell through the conservatory glass and caught the rim of my teacup. I was 23 years old, and I believed that love could cross the boundaries drawn by birth and fortune. I believed this because Thomas Ashworth had told me so, in whispered words beneath the linden trees, in letters that smelled of tobacco and hope. The Ashworths lived in the great house on Belmont Square, where the carriages gleamed black as beetles, and the servants wore livery the color of forest moss. My father kept a chemist's shop on Harrow Street, respectable but modest, our rooms above smelling perpetually of camphor and glycerin. I had been educated beyond my station, my mother insisting on French and piano, despite my father's protests about the expense. She died when I was 17, leaving me with her amber brooch and a voice in my head that whispered I was meant for something more than measuring powders and wrapping parcels in brown paper. Thomas came into the shop one October morning, his cravat slightly loosened, looking for a remedy for his father's gout. I remember how he smiled when I suggested the devil's claw tincture, how his eyes lingered on my face as I wrapped the bottle. He returned the next week and the week after until my father began to notice and grew quiet in that particular way that meant disapproval and fear. For 18 months, we existed in the spaces between propriety and scandal. He met me at the lending library, where respectable young women could linger without suspicion. We walked in the public gardens, always with my friend Charlotte trailing at a careful distance. He brought me books of poetry and spoke of a world where birth mattered less than character, where a woman's mind could be valued as much as her dowry. I let myself believe in this world because his voice made it sound inevitable, because when he looked at me, I felt seen in a way I had never experienced before. I should have recognized the signs earlier, the way his invitations never extended to his family home, the manner in which he grew tense when we encountered his acquaintances, introducing me with studied casualness as Miss Eleanor Shaw, a friend from the lending library. The increasing intervals between his visits, always explained by obligations and commitments that grew more numerous as spring turned to summer. But I was young, and I had allowed hope to become a kind of blindness. The afternoon everything shattered, I was wearing my best dress, a dove gray silk that had taken 3 months of my wages to commission. Thomas had finally invited me to tea at Belmont Square, a formal introduction to his parents. I interpreted this as a declaration, a public acknowledgement of what had grown between us. I dressed with trembling hands, pinning my mother's brooch at my collar like a talisman. Charlotte helped me with my hair, weaving it into an elaborate chignon that took an hour to perfect. The Ashworth drawing room was everything I had imagined, and more. Walls the color of old parchment, paintings in gilt frames depicting landscapes I would never see. Furniture so delicate, it seemed to float above the Persian carpets. Lady Ashworth sat beside the fire, like a portrait herself, her posture so rigid it looked architectural. Lord Ashworth stood near the window, his profile carved from marble and privilege. Thomas stood between them, and even before anyone spoke, I could see the defeat in the set of his shoulders. Miss Shaw. Lady Ashworth's voice could have frozen wine. She did not rise. She did not extend her hand. My son has informed us of his attachment to you. The word hung in the air like something distasteful, an attachment, as if I were a bit of lint clinging to expensive fabric. Thomas has spoken of his regard for you, Lord Ashworth said, turning from the window with the slow deliberation of a judge preparing to deliver sentence. And we have come to understand the depth of this entanglement. I looked at Thomas, waiting for him to correct them, to claim me with the same certainty he had shown in the shadowed corners of the lending library. He met my eyes for one brief moment, then looked away. My dear girl, Lady Ashworth continued, and the endearment dripped with contempt. Surely you must understand the impossibility of this situation. Thomas is the heir to considerable property and an ancient name. His wife will need to navigate society, manage estates, represent the family in circles that require certain refinements of birth and education. I am educated, I said quietly, though my voice shook. I speak French. I have read. You have read books. Lord Ashworth's dismissal was absolute. That is commendable in a shopkeeper's daughter. But breeding, Miss Shaw, cannot be acquired from books. It is not a skill one learns, but a heritage one inherits. You may be a perfectly adequate young woman in your sphere, but you are not, and can never be, one of us. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I waited for Thomas to speak, to defend me, to prove that the words he had whispered in the garden had been more than the idle entertainment of a bored gentleman. But he stood there, mute and pale, his hands clasped behind his back. "Thomas has agreed," Lady Ashworth said, "to end this association. It has gone on too long already and has exposed you to expectations that can never be fulfilled. He will not contact you again. We trust you will respect the dignity of all parties by accepting this decision with grace." I rose from my chair, though I have no memory of deciding to stand. My hands, I noticed with distant fascination, were completely steady as I smoothed my skirt. I looked at Thomas one final time, giving him a last chance to claim some shred of the man I had believed him to be. He stared at the carpet. "Thank you," I said to Lady Ashworth, "for clarifying the situation." I walked from that drawing room with my spine straight and my head high, though inside I felt as if I were watching myself from a great distance, a marionette performing dignity while everything essential had been carved away. The footman opened the door. The afternoon light assaulted my eyes. I walked down the steps of Belmont Square and into the ordinary chaos of the street, where costermongers called their wares and flower girls hawked violets, where life continued in complete indifference to the fact that mine had just been judged insufficient. That night, I sat in my room above the chemist's shop and stared at the wall. I did not weep. I could not. The humiliation had gone too deep for tears, settling into my bones like a chill that would never fully leave. I understood, with a clarity that felt like ice forming in my veins, that I had been nothing more than an amusement, a diversion, a way for Thomas Ashworth to feel romantic and rebellious without risking anything that actually mattered. And I understood something else, something that grew clearer as the night deepened and the street outside fell silent. I would not simply accept this. I would not fade into obscurity, a cautionary tale whispered about the dangers of aspiring above one's station. If they wanted to make me disappear, they would first have to watch me become visible in ways they had never imagined. I rose from my bed and lit the lamp. I took out paper and pen. I began to write. Over the following months, I became a student of the Ashworth family with a focus that would have impressed my old schoolmistress. I learned their habits, their schedule, their social calendar. I read every society column, noting their appearances at balls and dinners and charitable functions. I listened to gossip at the lending library, the market, the Sunday church services where I arrived early and lingered late, absorbing information like my father's medicines absorbed into cloth. I learned that Lord Ashworth had parliamentary ambitions, that he styled himself a reformer concerned with the welfare of the working classes. I learned that Lady Ashworth led a charitable organization dedicated to improving conditions for young women in service, that she gave speeches about the moral duty of the privileged toward the less fortunate. I learned that Thomas was being positioned for a political career, his marriage to be a strategic alliance that would cement the family's influence. The hypocrisy was so perfect, it was almost beautiful. I also began to transform myself, but not in the way they might have expected. I did not attempt to mimic their refinements or ape their manners. Instead, I became more deliberately myself, but with a new kind of precision. I took a position as a teacher at the Ragged School on Milton Street, where children from the poorest families came for basic education. I threw myself into this work with genuine passion, discovering that I had a gift for reaching minds that others had dismissed as hopeless. I wrote articles for the small reform newspapers about educational access and the waste of human potential when birth dictated destiny. And slowly, very slowly, I began to be noticed. The Reverend Marcus Weatherby, an elderly clergyman with genuine progressive sympathies, became my inadvertent patron. He was impressed by my work at the school and began introducing me to his circle of reformers and intellectuals. Through him, I met Harriet Pemberton, whose fortune and widowhood had given her the freedom to champion causes that made her peers uncomfortable. She invited me to her salon, where writers and activists gathered to discuss everything from suffrage to factory conditions. I cultivated these relationships with the same care I had once given to Latin verbs. I was articulate, but never strident, passionate, but always measured. I let my intelligence show without apology, but wrapped it in a kind of earnest humility that made people feel generous rather than threatened. I became, in certain progressive circles, known, not famous, but recognizable. A young woman of modest origins doing remarkable work, living proof that character could transcend birth. I made sure every one of my small triumphs was reported in the reform newspapers that Lord Ashworth claimed to read, that Lady Ashworth pretended to support. It took nearly a year before I received the invitation I had been engineering toward. The annual benefit for the Society for the Aid of Distressed Gentlewomen, hosted by Lady Ashworth herself, seeking to raise funds through an evening of enlightened discourse and charitable performance. This year's theme, Education as the Great Equalizer. Harriet Pemberton had been invited to speak, and she had requested that I accompany her to provide a first-hand account of teaching the poor. Lady Ashworth could hardly refuse without exposing the limits of her charitable sympathies. The evening of the benefit, I dressed with the same care I had taken for that disastrous tea, but this time I chose my clothing as armor rather than costume. A simple dress of deep burgundy wool, well made but not ostentatious, with my mother's brooch at my throat. My hair arranged in a style that was elegant but unfussy. I looked like exactly what I was, a woman of modest means and serious purpose, someone who had earned her presence rather than purchased it with birth. The Ashworth ballroom glittered with candlelight and crystal, filled with the cream of society dressed in silks and jewels. I saw Lady Ashworth across the room, her smile freezing slightly when she recognized me. I saw Thomas, standing beside a young woman in pale blue satin, his hand possessive on her elbow. I recognized her from the society pages. Cecilia Thornton Marsh, daughter of a baronet, exactly the kind of strategic alliance his parents would have chosen. I felt nothing. Or rather, I felt something so clear and cold, it might have been mistaken for nothing. Harriet spoke first. Her words about educational opportunity met with polite applause. Then she introduced me, and I walked to the front of the room with steady steps, my hands folded calmly at my waist. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the hushed space. "I am Eleanor Shaw, and I teach reading to children whose parents cannot read. I teach arithmetic to girls who will spend their lives in service, mathematics to boys who will work in factories. I do this not because I believe education will make them into something they are not, but because I believe it will allow them to become more fully what they already are, human beings with dignity, intelligence, and potential." I paused, letting my gaze sweep the room, landing deliberately on Lady Ashworth. "I was told once that breeding cannot be learned from books, that refinement is inherited rather than acquired. And perhaps this is true, in the narrow sense that one cannot learn from a book the accidents of birth that grant status and privilege. But I have learned something more important, that character cannot be inherited, that kindness is not passed down through blood, and that the true measure of a person is not who their parents were, but who they choose to become." I saw Lady Ashworth's face tighten, saw Lord Ashworth shift uncomfortably near the window. "The children I teach are routinely dismissed as common, as beneath the notice of their betters. And yet I have seen more courage in a 9-year-old girl walking 3 miles through winter streets to learn her letters than I have ever witnessed in a drawing room. I have seen more genuine nobility in a boy sharing his bread with a younger child than I have observed in any amount of inherited titles or ancient names." The room was utterly silent now. Thomas had gone pale. Cecilia Thornton Marsh was staring at me with the kind of fascination usually reserved for carriage accidents. Those of us born without advantage are told to accept our limitations with grace, to be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity the fortunate choose to extend. But grace, I have learned, should not mean silence. And gratitude should not mean accepting judgment from those who have never questioned whether their own position was earned or merely awarded by the lottery of birth. I looked directly at Thomas for the first time, and I let him see everything I had not allowed myself to feel for the past year. The hurt, yes, but more than that, the contempt for his weakness, the understanding that he had been smaller than I had imagined, that my disappointment was not in losing him, but in having ever believed he was worth keeping. "I am grateful," I continued, "for the education that taught me to value my own mind. I am grateful for the work that has shown me where true nobility resides, and I am grateful for every closed door that forced me to find my own path, rather than following someone else's into a life of compromise and pretense." I stepped back from the front of the room, my message delivered, and walked calmly toward the exit. I did not wait for applause or condemnation. I did not glance back to see the faces of those I had just indicted with perfect politeness, but I heard the whispers start before I reached the door. The aftermath unfolded over the following weeks like ripples spreading from a stone thrown into still water. I had not named the Ashworths directly, but everyone present understood exactly what I had said and to whom I had said it. The scandal was not loud but pervasive, the kind of social wound that seeps rather than bleeds. Harriet Pemberton told me later that Lord Ashworth's political allies began to quietly distance themselves, uneasy about being associated with a man whose actions so clearly contradicted his public principles. Lady Ashworth's charitable organization lost several prominent members, women who had suddenly become very interested in the hypocrisy of preaching aid for distressed gentlewomen while crushing a shopkeeper's daughter for aspiring to their circles. Thomas's engagement to Cecilia Thornton Marsh was quietly dissolved 3 months later. I heard from Charlotte that the baronet's daughter had expressed concerns about marrying into a family whose values seemed so performative. But the most unexpected consequence came on a gray morning in early spring when I received a letter delivered by private messenger. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper heavy and expensive. I opened it standing by the window of the school, children's voices echoing from the classroom behind me. Dear Miss Shaw, I hope you will forgive the presumption of this letter. We have not been formally introduced, though I had the privilege of hearing you speak at my aunt's benefit last autumn. I am Jonathan Fairfax, recently returned from 7 years in India, managing the family's commercial interests in Calcutta. I write because I was present that evening, and your words struck me with unusual force, not simply because of their eloquence, though they were eloquent, but because they articulated something I have long felt but never heard expressed in such company, that honor resides in action rather than ancestry, and that the greatest indignity is not being denied entry to drawing rooms, but being forced to pretend that such rooms contain anything worth entering. I am establishing a school in the East End for the children of factory workers, a project that has made me quite unpopular with my own family. I am told you have considerable experience with such work. If you would be willing to meet and discuss the possibility of directing this institution, I would be deeply grateful for your time and expertise. I realize this letter may seem forward, particularly from a stranger, but I confess I'm tired of the elaborate courtship rituals of society, the pretense and positioning that seems to define every interaction among our so-called betters. I would prefer to approach you directly, as one person of serious purpose to another, and let you judge my character by my actions rather than my pedigree. If you are willing to consider this proposal, I will be at the Temperance Tea Room on Aldgate Street this Thursday at 2 o'clock. If you do not come, I will understand and trouble you no further. With sincere respect, Jonathan Fairfax. I folded the letter and stood very still, feeling something unfamiliar and strange moving through my chest. Not hope exactly, something more cautious than that, but also not its opposite. On Thursday, I wore my burgundy dress and my mother's brooch. I walked into the Temperance Tea Room at precisely 2 o'clock and saw him immediately. A tall man with serious eyes and ink stains on his fingers, sitting at a corner table with architectural drawings spread before him. He stood when he saw me, and something in his expression told me he understood that this meeting was not just about a school, but about the careful negotiation of two people who had both learned that the world's promises were often false, but who had not yet entirely abandoned the possibility of truth. Miss Shaw, he said, and in his voice I heard the same weariness I carried, the same hard-won wisdom about where genuine worth resided. Mr. Fairfax, I replied, and sat down across from him to discuss the future. The school opened 6 months later in a converted warehouse, with classrooms for 200 children and a staff of teachers trained in methods I had developed over years of practice. Jonathan proved to be exactly what his letter had suggested: serious, committed, refreshingly direct. He worked beside me without condescension, deferred to my expertise without ego, and shared my belief that education was not charity, but justice. Somewhere in those months of planning and building, of arguing over curriculum and interviewing teachers, of watching plaster dust turn to classrooms, friendship became something deeper. Not the fevered romance of my youth, but something more solid and reciprocal, built on shared purpose and mutual respect. When he asked me to marry him, it was after a particularly frustrating meeting with the local council, both of us exhausted and covered in chalk dust, standing in the empty school as evening light fell through the tall windows. I love you, he said simply. Not despite who you are or where you came from, but because of it, because you are brave and brilliant and you see the world as it is, rather than as you were told it should be. I want to build a life with you that matters, where we make something real together. Will you marry me? I looked at this man who had proven himself through action rather than promises, who had chosen difficulty over comfort, who saw my strength rather than measuring my deficiencies. I thought of the girl who had walked from Belmont Square with her dignity in tatters, who had believed she needed to be rescued by a man too weak to rescue even himself. Yes, I said. We married quietly in a small church with Charlotte and Harriet as witnesses. No grand society wedding, no performance of status, just vows spoken with intention, a partnership acknowledged, a future begun. I heard through the inevitable channels of gossip that the Ashworths attended a wedding that same season, Thomas finally marrying a woman of appropriate birth, a union that satisfied his parents' ambitions and required nothing of him but compliance. I felt no satisfaction in this knowledge, but neither did I feel regret. Their lives had continued on the trajectory they had always been destined for, and mine had diverged onto a path I had built myself. I am 43 now, writing this in the study of the house Jonathan and I share near the school we built together. Our 3 children are grown, each of them inheriting not titles or fortune, but the example of lives lived with purpose. The school has expanded twice, and last year the government cited it as a model institution in a report on educational reform. Sometimes, at public functions we cannot avoid, I encounter people from that world I was once excluded from. Lady Ashworth is elderly now, her charitable organization long since dissolved, her influence faded. Lord Ashworth never achieved his political ambitions, his reform rhetoric exposed too often by his private actions. Thomas holds his inherited title and manages his inherited properties and lives, I imagine, exactly the life that was always planned for him. When I see them, I am polite but distant, not from lingering anger, but from genuine indifference. They are strangers who briefly intersected with my story but never truly mattered to it. What they meant to destroy, they refined. What they meant to diminish, they forced to grow stronger. They judged me too common to join them, and in this, at least, they were correct. I was never common enough to settle for the poverty of their privilege, the emptiness of their elevated sphere. I think of that young woman walking from Belmont Square, feeling as if she had been diminished into nothing. I wish I could tell her what I know now, that the greatest revenge is not destruction but transcendence, not proving yourself worthy of their world but building a better one they could never enter. I was told I did not belong, and I learned this was not an insult but a liberation.